So, the acquisition and retention imbalance, which for these guys, I think we can boil that down to churn often, is what we're going to talk about it. But before we do, Ragy, Adi, and Nicolas, maybe you just explain briefly what each of your business does so that we can contextualize it for all of us.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay, so Algolia, we are a search platform. So we help businesses like Medium or many others to power their search, to deliver a great search experience. So if you search there, you're actually using us. Today we power about 1 billion queries per day all over the world.
Okay, Eddie?
We are Sisense. We are simplifying complex data. We allow company to bring all the data sources together for an ever-growing data sets and basically uncover hidden opportunities.
Ragy?
So Sprinklr is a social media management platform for the enterprise. What that means is we work with companies like Microsoft and McDonald's and Nike in all their markets across their business units to do marketing, advertising, research, commerce, and care across Facebook, Twitter, and 23 other social networks like that. And you can do that from one platform.
Okay, so generally then, so you know we're focused on churn. How do you, if whichever of you would like to take it first, how do you define churn?
I'll start. It's an unhappy customer.
Yeah.
That's basically
it. Is it as simple as that? Is it an unhappy customer, or is it just disengaged?
It's
like
more towards the value.
Yeah.
I mean, there is not enough value in the service that you provide, which makes the person or the company on the other side just not to renew. That's a churn from my perspective.
And you know the way we're very focused, say business is very focused on revenue and shareholders, revenue and growth. But do you guys have the issue where churn is a serious metric that people care about and measure, and as a result then try to fix?
Of course, I mean, churn is kind of the key driver of any SaaS business. It's kind of like the
rather
leaky,
than revenue, Nick.
Yeah, it's the leaky bucket. If you
Okay.
add a lot of revenue, but your bucket is leaking, you can add as much as you want. In the end, it's going to leak too fast for you to really grow fast.
Okay, yeah. Ragy, and from your perspective?
So there is, if you are venture-backed or if you have any scale, churn is calculated two ways. You're either measuring dollar churn, or you're measuring customer churn, customer count. So is the customer leaving you completely, or a customer buying less? In terms of, for a SaaS, in terms of how important that is, if you're a SaaS company, guys, churn is arguably more important than revenue growth. It's the primary metric you need to be tracking if you want to build a growing company in the SaaS world.
Okay. And then, right, so churn is a problem that we'll continue to deal with. Acquisition in a SaaS world. And so I imagine that there are a lot of people in the audience, startups and larger companies. This is incredibly important as they start this journey. Churn, we can deal with later when things go a little awry. Acquisition, from a Sisense perspective or an Algolia perspective, how do you drive the acquisition from the very start?
So we are a company that exists for more than 13 years, so we have churn in our blood. So I mean, this is what we care about, as Ragy said here. We are looking into the onboarding process and the acquisition process as the most important step in order to avoid churn in the future. So what we do is basically set expectations and a few steps with the customer to allow the other side to anticipate what's going to happen and understand what the value is going to get in the process. By doing that, we also get some kind of let's say investment from them. It's a time investment, which is not very clear to start with. When you buy something, you don't expect to spend more than you already paid by money.
Nicolas, from your perspective, pitfalls when it comes to acquisition?
So I think getting back to that churn metric linked to acquisition, I think another interesting metric is actually NPS, Net Promoter Score, which is maybe even more important than churn in a way, because it's going to predict both future churn, but also future acquisition. A high NPS is going to lower your churn, but also increase your referrals, which means that in that way, by focusing on preventing churn, on making your customers happy, you are driving more customers for the future, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Ragy, from your perspective, what Nicolas said on the NPS measurement?
So NPS is a leading indicator. So when we think about churn and leading indicators, we track 4 things. One is adoption. How much of what you've bought are you using? 2 is relationship. How many people do we know at the customer side? Because a lot of times it's, regardless of how much value you create, you have to have a certain level of relationship to do a bigger deal or maintain a bigger deal. Third one is a slightly interesting one for us. We call it the stickiness metric. So we know that if our customers are using features that are unique to Sprinklr, then it's harder for them to leave. So we track how much or how many of those features are they using. And the fourth one is how much business value are we creating for that company that they acknowledge. So these are the, we call it the 4 Ds, but the sort of the leading indicators we track to predict churn.
Okay, and Ragy's raised an interesting point about features unique to a service. So, cancelling a SoundCloud Pro account is very easy and people forget they have one. Cancelling an account system subscription, cloud subscription, is a far completely different proposition. If there is a more complex onboarding process, in the sense that customization, advanced feature set, or whatever, does that really eradicate churn or reduce it significantly because of the buy-in of the customer?
Not sure to be the best one to answer this one, because we really focus on making our product as simple as possible to implement. And we bet on the fact that our customers' happiness is more important than making sure keeping them with this kind of complex implementations.
Adi, from your perspective?
Complexity always increase the churn risk. So you try, as I said, we usually as a company, as a data company, we eat our own dog food. We try to be within the numbers. We try to understand what makes a better onboarding, what makes a less great onboarding, and maybe we need to point ourselves to a different niche in the market in order to make a more successful onboarding. But definitely complexity is a direct relation to churn.
And what is the perfect onboarding process in the sense that multiple cost options, time, investment by the customer?
It all gets to a value. So even if it's 3 weeks process, it's usually less than that. 3 weeks process, and the prospect comes to us and tells us, guys, you just saved me $300 million. True story, by the way. That's value, and he will never. It's not that he will never leave you, but he will be very happy throughout the experience with you.
Excuse me. And do you think generally? I know when we talked about churn as an important metric, is it always churn and acquisition, Ragy? Do they belong together? Or are they, or even from a business perspective, do you have different people responsible for each?
No, with scale, we're 1,500 people in 23 offices around the world, so we necessarily have to separate out functions to scale the business. But acquisition and churn go hand in hand. Otherwise you're filling a bucket that's leaking. So it makes no sense to keep filling it from the top if you don't have a handle on churn. Another thing that's not obvious for a lot of people is, at least for businesses like ours, keeping customers from churning involves keeping them happy. And keeping them happy is the single best way to get them to buy more. So upselling and churn mitigation go hand in hand. New logo acquisition, new customer acquisition is a separate team. But the team that keeps customers happy should be the same team that is responsible for preventing customers from churning out.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, Nicolas, would you?
Yeah. What I was going to say is that actually it's important to look at churn as a metric, but net churn is actually even more important. It's really looking how much upgrades you have compared to the lost business.
Okay, Adi, on that?
I absolutely agree. Net churn, if you're in a positive net churn, yes, some customers may leave, but the ones that are happy are going to expand, and we experience it with it a lot in a SaaS model in the B2B world. Definitely, being on a positive side of that makes the company very profitable.
Across all of your businesses, do you think self-service, in the sense that self-service onboarding, does that make for a better customer experience, in the sense that when you look at people self-serve onboarding, that's great acquisition, low-cost acquisition, but have you discovered that it creates the potential for churn, that just the self-serving, the lack of personality almost?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's a question of self-serve that much. Of course, it's important. The more you help your customers to onboard, the better retention you're going to have. But the key here is more the size of the customers. Self-serve customers in our business are smaller customers, and you were speaking about churn customers being unhappy customers. Not always. The small ones, you cannot avoid them to go out of business. That's not necessarily unhappy customers. It's actually maybe future customers. What we've seen is that some of our churn customers became new customers at different companies. Right. And so from one churn, we got several new customers.
Interesting.
That was very positive churn.
Yeah. Can I just ask you generally, before we might look at kind of some tips for startups in relation to reducing churn and the acquisition story just in the last few minutes, but SaaS companies that shouldn't be SaaS companies, have you come across businesses where they have a model that it's a SaaS business, but they have high rates of churn, and maybe the problem is that actually they're software businesses or consulting businesses, not viable SaaS businesses? Adi, what do you...
Definitely, we see companies
without naming them.
Yeah, exactly. Without giving any names, we see only in the last year, specifically in our field, BI, the big data, companies with high churn numbers. When you get a lot of investment, investors want return for their money. But when the high churn goes into play, we didn't talk about numbers, but when the high churns go into play, the valuations go drastically down. And SaaS companies have great valuation just because it's keep on growing and have low amount of churn, and we see it all across the board today.
Ragy, the regionalization of churn, acquisition v churn, does it differ around the world in different markets in your experience?
No, I think it's probably more a function of what you do and what kind of services you offer, more than any regional bias from what we see. Generally there are three models, right? The high-touch model, the low-touch model, and an all-technology model, right? If you are Netflix, it's all technology, like everything is in the platform. Then there is low-touch, where you can provide some onboarding, but it's mostly cookie cutter. And then there's high-touch, where it's completely discovery, implementation, and handoff, which is mostly what we do. So what we see is variations by business model, more so than variations by region, because if the value that you provide is compelling and it's a fairly substantial partnership, then it's likely to be sticky around the world.
Okay. And when we talk about acquisition and making it better, do any of you right now focus on, do you do analysis about the customers, the long-term customers, the customer who's come and stayed, and what we do for them, that is obviously really good. Do you do any analysis like that?
We're still we're the earlier stage company here. We are just 160 people. So it's still early for us to invest a lot in that.
Yeah.
But we get.
Do you think it's worthwhile?
Of course it is, but you have so many things that are worthwhile that you have to prioritize. No, the thing is that even at our stage, we can tell without even looking too closely at doing complex analysis. You can tell that, of course, like a big enterprise, is going to stay longer with you as soon as they start to see some value and invest resource on top of you. Whereas a fast scaling startup that is just using you because that's helping them going faster on the market, maybe the long-term relationship is a bit more risky. So you have to invest maybe a bit more also to make sure they are successful with you.
Okay. Eddie, from your perspective, and say being conscious of the number of startup companies in the audience, what would you say to them? How do you reduce churn? Your kind of two best tips in reducing churn and focusing on the acquisition.
The first tip would be to growth hack your first experience with the product. Many of us think that we build a product for first interaction and making value throughout the process, but just think about an organization you sell to. If they bring another guy and another guy just to use your product, they are just like new users. So we try to growth hack all these new experiences, and we try to build, I'm calling it skill acquisition, to give them minor skills to acquire. We're using learning systems in order to teach them, automated and also manual. So that's the first tip. Basically, treat as any new user, doesn't matter if it's an old customer or a new one, as a totally new user.
Right.
The second one is definitely to understand not just the NPS, as you know, an NPS is just a number. Behind it, there are a huge amount of numbers, at least from our perspective. It's how many actions they did per week, what kind of items, like Ragy said, they're using the entire week. It's utilization and engagement. That's what we're looking for.
Okay, interesting. Ragy, yours?
Give you 3 tips. The first one is focus on value. Create value with your product. You know, everything else is gimmicky. It won't stand the test of time. You can get a product that's cool, get a lot of people to use it, but it will just fade away. Second one is remove friction. So in everything you do, find out where users are having friction in the usage of your product and remove it. The third one is a corollary of the second one, which is increase stickiness. So there are features and things you can do that make the customer dependent on the product for continued value. Be it ROI features inside the platform or stuff like automation or reporting or whatever. If you are sending a report every week to your executive team from your platform, then your platform is likely to be sticky because they don't want to switch to a different set of numbers at any point. So removal of friction and increasing stickiness along with creation of value.
Where do you start in that process? Remove friction, add features, stickiness. What's the first thing you do? Is it about value?
Value.
Yeah.
I always start with value, because if you don't have a clear value proposition that you can look a customer in the eye and say, this is why you should use our product, then everything else don't make sense.
And Nicolas, from Algolia's point of view, creating value, how did you do that, or how did you start that process?
Listen to customers. I think the most important, especially in the beginning, is to create a relationship with the customers, create trust, so that they are going to tell you when you are not the best, when you could do better, what is missing. And when you build that trust and you deliver, or better, you over-deliver on what they tell you, that's going to make them like lifelong customers.
Eddie, just on pricing, in the context of that, how important is pricing and getting it right from an offering point of view?
It's never about pricing. It's all about the value that you provide throughout the pricing. It's what do they get throughout this process. So there's nothing expensive or too expensive. It's total cost of ownership. How much effort you need to get in order to do it on your own, how much effort you need to get in order to do it with us, with our competitors. And if you bring enough value into the process, pricing doesn't really matter.
How do you define the value, though? You know, for people who are starting businesses, SaaS business, yeah, we know this is brilliant, but is it worth 1 or 10 or 50 in subscription fees? How do you define that?
Variate between the businesses. I mean, every business has its own, some companies want to have lower churn, and if we help them to do that, they're happy. Some of them want more profit. So it's always about, the business itself and its pains.
Ragy, has pricing ever been an issue for you in that respect? Have you ever struggled with equating it to value?
No, all the companies I've created have been in the premium space. So I love charging more, but the key is focusing on value, right? And value is black and white. It should never be confused. If you're confused about am I creating value, you probably are not creating value. There are only 3 primary drivers for businesses. You're either helping them increase revenue, decrease costs, or manage risk. So value should be quantified in one of those 3, not in any other fluffy way.
And Nicolas, increase value, reduce churn, is that a fair equation?
Of course, the more you increase the value, the less churn you're going to have.
Yeah. Okay, listen guys, Ragy Thomas, Adi Azaria, and Nicolas Dessaigne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thanks
Thank
everybody.
You.